Since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, the Russian economy has plunged into a severe crisis. Once a titan supported by its vast reserves of natural resources, Russia now teeters on the brink of economic collapse. In a dramatic shift, Russia saw over $600 billion erased from its reserves overnight, sending the ruble into a tailspin that threatens the entire economic structure of the nation. With rigorous sanctions severing its vital economic connections, the rapid unraveling of Russia's fiscal stability raises urgent questions. Russia's economic strength, historically buoyed by its robust exports of oil and gas, has been compromised. Prior to the conflict, these exports commanded the global stage, funneling substantial revenues into the country. However, the Western response to the invasion of Ukraine was swift, with a broad rejection of Russian energy, significantly curtailing its primary income source. In an attempt to mitigate these losses, Russia then turned its attention towards China and India, aiming to redirect its exports. Nonetheless, the complexity of sanctions has stifled these efforts, particularly with India, which faces its own geopolitical pressures and the potential repercussions of maintaining trade ties with Russia. Now, here's what you need to understand. The Russian economy is not insulated from global dynamics. It relies heavily on imports to sustain its domestic markets. As the ruble's value deteriorates, the potential for a comprehensive economic downturn looms, potentially reverberating throughout the nation. Despite efforts to diversify its economic partners, challenges persist. China's demanding economic terms and the logistical hurdles of reorienting supply chains from Europe to Asia underscore the difficulties. Establishing new infrastructure, such as pipelines and ports, is not only costly but also time-consuming, further straining Russia's financial resources. This scenario is not unprecedented. Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 led to international sanctions that triggered a recession, devalued the ruble, and spiked inflation. The current sanctions extend even deeper, striking at the core sectors of the economy. Russia's previous strategies for economic resilience are now under severe strain, tested by the extensive and profound impacts of these international restrictions. Now, following the invasion on February 24, 2022, the Russian economy was swiftly impacted, with inflation rocketing to 17.8% by April, primarily due to the steep depreciation of the ruble and sanctions-induced shortages, which spiked prices. In stark contrast, during the same period, inflation in the United States began to moderate, settling at 8.3%. And that underscored that the economic turmoil in Russia was largely attributable to targeted sanctions instead of broader global economic conditions. Reacting to these pressures, the Russian central bank took drastic measures, elevating interest rates from a pre-war 9.5% to 20%, which effectively helped to taper inflation to 12% by the end of 2022. It wasn't great, but it was a change. The early months of 2023 saw a significant deflationary trend, with inflation plummeting to 2.3% by April, positioning Russia among the nations with the lowest inflation rates worldwide at that juncture. Now, here's where things get really interesting. This decrease occurred without further hikes in interest rates, which in fact were reduced 6 times between April and September 2022, down to 7.5%. And despite this, from May to November 2023, inflation consistently climbed each month, reaching 7.5%. Recent months have seen persistent high inflation rates, with figures holding at 7.4% in December 2023 and January 2024, and escalating up to 7.7% in February 2024, marking the highest rate since the previous year. This inflationary persistence in the face of fluctuating interest rates challenges conventional economic expectations that typically link higher interest rates with lower inflation. Now, we've got to take a look at some other countries as well. When positioned alongside other major economies within the G20, Russia's inflation scenario becomes even more stark. Currently, Russia records the third highest inflation rate among these nations, trailing only behind Argentina and Turkey. Now, Argentina's got a terrible, absolutely grave inflation crisis at an astonishing 276%, which underscores severe economic instability. Turkey, with an inflation rate of 67%, which looks good compared to Argentina but is still not good overall, is grappling with significant devaluation of its currency, which escalates cost for all imported goods. Comparatively, Russia's inflation rates exceed those of South Africa, India, Brazil, and Mexico, countries facing their own economic challenges but with relatively lower inflation figures. This persistent rise in inflation in Russia is particularly alarming, given the measures taken to curb it. Conventionally, increasing interest rates should mitigate inflation, as it discourages borrowing and spending while encouraging savings. However, despite these efforts, Russia's inflation rates have continued to escalate, indicating the complexity and intractability of the current economic conditions. The economic theory suggests that reduced consumer spending against a backdrop of unchanged supply should lead to a decrease in prices and, consequently, a decrease in inflation. This principle guided the Russian central bank strategy post the 2022 Ukraine invasion, which initially drove inflation to a peak of 18%. In response, the central bank escalated the official interest rate to an unprecedented 20% to stabilize the economy. However, this stringent measure was short-lived. Within 6 months, interest rates had retreated to pre-war levels of 7.5% by September 2022, only to start climbing again by mid-2023. By July of 2023, the economic landscape necessitated another adjustment, leading to a series of rate hikes over 6 months, culminating in a 16% rate by December 2023. This level of interest rate is highly restrictive, aiming to staunch borrowing and spending. Historical comparisons highlight the anomaly of such rates. In the United States, for example, one would have to look back to the global recession of 1981 to find comparable rates when inflation stood at 14%, and that was a long time ago. Similarly, the UK experienced rates over 16% in 1980 when its inflation was at 18%. The current rate of 16% in Russia appears disproportionately high, considering the current inflation rate of just 7.7%. This disparity raises significant questions about the consistency and rationale behind the monetary policies of the Bank of Russia, especially notable given the drastic reduction in inflation from approximately 12% to 2% during a period of stable interest rates. Now, amidst these domestic challenges, Russia's exclusion from Western financial networks like SWIFT has compounded its economic difficulties, severely disrupting its international financial transactions. This has propelled Russia towards developing alternative financial mechanisms, notably increasing transactions in the Chinese yuan to facilitate trade with China. While these adaptations offer some respite, they fall short of fully replacing the benefits derived from integration with Western financial markets, which are typically considered by stability and trust. Moreover, the broader impact of international sanctions extends beyond financial isolation. The sanctions have critically hindered Russia's access to Western technology and expertise, which is necessary for advanced energy exploration and extraction projects, such as deepwater drilling and Arctic ventures. This technology deficit starkly curtails Russia's capacity to develop new energy resources, thereby posing a long-term risk to the sustainability of its energy sector and, therefore, economic health. The interplay of these factors underscores the complexities of Russia's current economic strategy and the profound influence of geopolitical dynamics on its monetary policies. This economic scenario in Russia yields two plausible interpretations. Firstly, it's possible that the inflation metrics reported a year ago were inaccurately low, masking a higher actual rate of inflation. In other words, something was being hidden. Alternatively, the escalation and rigorous enforcement of sanctions over the past 6 months might be exerting unprecedented stress on the Russian economy, catalyzing a sharp spike in inflation rates. Typically, an increase in a country's interest rates tends to bolster its currency value. Higher rates are supposed to attract foreign investments seeking lucrative returns, potentially leading to a surge in capital inflow. However, the recent drastic escalation of interest rates in Russia paints a starkly different picture. Despite these increases, the Russian ruble has continued to depreciate, significantly diminishing the purchasing power of the Russian populace. The resulting cost escalation of imported commodities, including vital items like food and medicine, has substantially inflated prices, thereby diminishing the standard of living and igniting widespread public dissatisfaction. Government attempts to mitigate this through subsidies and price controls have achieved limited success, further exacerbating the fiscal strain on the national budget. Now, let's look back in history just a little bit. A year ago, the exchange rate hovered around 75 rubles to the US dollar, which again isn't great, but anyway, it's now depreciated to approximately 93 rubles per dollar, which is 20% over the year. In July 2023, the official interest rate stood at 7.5%, but it's alarmingly doubled to 16% since. Despite this significant rise, the ruble's value has only marginally slipped from 89 to 93 against the dollar in the last 8 months, marking a mere 4.5% decline. This observation suggests two critical insights. First, the ruble's valuation appears increasingly decoupled from Russia's interest rate policies. Even a hypothetical hike to 100% would unlikely allure substantial international capital under the current geopolitical and economic conditions. Secondly, the ruble's devaluation is primarily driven by the overarching difficulties plaguing the Russian economy, rather than direct impacts from changes in the interest rates. President Vladimir Putin has recently secured re-election for another 6-year term, following his victory in 2018. During his previous campaign, he committed to enhancing the living standards and increasing the life expectancy of Russian citizens. An examination of these promises shows a complex picture of success and shortfall. In 2017, the poverty rate in Russia stood at 12.9%, with the poverty line defined as a monthly income of less than 14,339 rubles, which is about 157 US dollars. Now, Putin vowed to slash this rate to 6.5%. However, by the end of his term, the poverty rate had only marginally decreased to 9.3%, notably missing the ambitious target he set. More recently, Putin has articulated a new objective to reduce the poverty rate to 7% by 2030. In 2023, the Russian government implemented several initiatives aimed at alleviating poverty, which included increasing wages in response to labor shortages, enhancing benefits for families and children, boosting salaries to attract contract soldiers, and compensating families of those impacted by the conflict in Ukraine. While these measures have potentially reduced poverty rates, they've simultaneously fueled inflation, further complicating the economic landscape. Additionally, Russia's grappling with demographic challenges that exacerbate its economic difficulties. An aging population and a declining birth rate are contributing to a contracting workforce, posing significant long-term obstacles to economic growth and the sustainability of social services. In response, the government has launched initiatives to promote higher birth rates and improve healthcare services, though the effects of these policies are expected to materialize gradually. They're probably going to take a while. Another significant commitment from Putin's 2018 campaign was to raise Russia's life expectancy to 78 years by 2024. At the time, life expectancy was 72.3 years, and it's since increased slightly to 73.1 years. Nevertheless, this figure remains considerably below the targeted 78 years. Life expectancy is a vital measure of living standards, as it typically correlates with the overall quality of life. Current statistics indicate that the improvements in living conditions in Russia have been limited and fall short of the levels promised by President Putin. Amidst this backdrop of underachievement, the Russian economy continues to wrestle with formidable challenges, exacerbated by high interest rates. The Russian ruble persists in its decline, thereby escalating the cost of imported goods and intensifying a vicious cycle where rising import costs propel inflation further. Russia's economic landscape displays severe distress, resistant to straightforward resolutions. While the Bank of Russia might consider elevating interest rates to levels seen in nations experiencing economic tumult, what we need to understand is that such drastic actions could precipitate significant issues, including a preference among the populace for more stable currencies, like the US dollar over the ruble. The strain on the Russian economy is largely attributable to persistent international sanctions, which continue to shake its foundation. If inflation escalates further, the central bank might be compelled to curtail its monetary injections into the economy, potentially precipitating a recession. This presents a complex scenario, especially given the government's projection of an economic growth rate of 3 to 4% in 2024. Now, let's make one thing clear. The forthcoming months are pivotal. They will reveal how Russia manages these economic adversities and whether it can stabilize its economy or faces worsening conditions. Observers remain vigilant regarding Russia's maneuvers on the global stage. Shifts in foreign policy, especially those related to the conflict in Ukraine, could significantly influence the duration and intensity of sanctions. A strategic pivot in diplomatic negotiations or military tactics may foster a gradual relaxation of sanctions, offering some economic reprieve. Conversely, continued or intensified aggression could tighten the sanctions' grip, exacerbating Russia's isolation and economic difficulties. If you like our content, please don't forget to like this video and hit the bell icon to see our next exciting video on why religion is dominating the southern United States of America. See you next time.